Good evening. Thank you for being here. I'm Sanjay Reddy, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event on understanding Xi Jinping's grand reform strategy. Of course, the topic is of great interest to many of us who are trying to understand what is happening in China, but it's a special pleasure that we have here with us for a few weeks now, somebody whom I admire very much and have had the privilege to know for some years, Cui Jiayuan, who is a professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing and was previously a professor at MIT, where I first got to know him, that is when he was a professor there. Who I would say is one of the most creative and interesting scholars working on China. And of course, he's more than a scholar. He's also a person who's trying to think through what the potential future trajectory of China and indeed of the world as a whole could be. One of the first essays of his which I came across was an article on township and village enterprises in China, which introduced the concept of Möbius strip ownership, by which he meant a form of ownership in which it was not clear who were the outsiders and who were the insiders. If you think about the concept of a Möbius strip, if you know what that is, the brilliance of this metaphor will be immediately clear to you. And this is just one example of the many really striking formulations which he brings to bear, drawing on his very extensive, really magisterial knowledge of a wide number of fields. It's not uncommon in any one of his articles to find references to diverse traditions of philosophy, to economics. In fact, he knows much more economics than most economists, though formally he's a political scientist, to law and legal theory, social theory, history, and so on. And most recently, of course, in his work on the Chongqing experiment, which he spoke about last Friday here at the New School. Among other things, of course, he's the editor of the consolidated volume of Roberto Unger's work, Politics, and he has written his own manifesto for petit bourgeois socialism. You can ask him more about what that means. So it's my great pleasure to invite him to come and speak to us now for about 40 minutes, after which we have some very distinguished discussants, whom I will introduce at that time.
Thank you, Sanjay, for your very nice introduction. And it's my great pleasure to visit the New School and especially Indian China Institute. I enjoyed the New School as well as New York City, great deal. And I also want to thank you all for coming this evening. And Sanjay just mentioned my early essay on mobile strip ownership. So it's a very great pleasure. Actually, this innovation is not due to me, and I draw it from my former colleague and mentor, Charles Sabel, now teaching at Columbia Law School, and many other friends and colleagues who came this evening. I was asked by Ashok, the director of Indian China Institute in the New School, to talk about Xi Jinping's grand reform strategy. As many of you know, last November, Chinese Communist Party held the third plenum meeting, third plenum session of the 18th, the Central Committee of the 18th Party Congress. And in this plenary session, the CCP Central Committee announced 60 points grand reform strategy. It has been broadly perceived by all over the world as a manifesto of Xi Jinping's new idea about what China is moving to. And since he assumed the top leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and the state. And however, these 60 points third plenum resolution has been subject to competing interpretations. Seems there are some ambiguities, and both in China and in the West, there are a lot of debate what the precise meaning of those 16 points resolution. And as many of you may recall, in the last November, right after the communique of the third plenary session of the 18th Party Congress has been announced, like the New York Times, Forbes, and they all publish articles say it was disappointing. There are no grand vision of new opening for reform. That's the communique of the plenary session. But the second day, when the full text of the resolution was published, and the New York Times and Forbes and Times, they all changed the tone, saying that the communique and the full text was so different. And the full text actually is more promising about reform. And as well, in China, also a lot of debate what are the intention of Xi Jinping in these 60 points of reform. So what I'm trying to do today, is just my personal interpretation of this third plenum resolution. And I think the structure of my talk will be very simple. So basically, maybe I should start with this. The structure of this presentation. The first, I make a distinction of the overall goal and the framework goals of this third plenum decision. And then I talk a little bit about the local experiments follows the framework goals. And thirdly, I will talk about two examples of framework goal, namely the point 6 of this Xi Jinping's 60 points reform resolution and the point 20 of this reform resolution. And finally, I will talk about the examples of very briefly, the local experiments which supposed to realize those framework goals. First, let me say why I talk about the overall goal. Because both in Chinese media and Western media, right after the 18th Party Congress third plenary session, which was, as I mentioned, is last November, the press emphasis is mostly on the so-called decisive role to let market playing the decisive role in the resource allocation. Because in the communique, the first day of announcement, this word was not in communique, but in the full text, this word was in the full text. So most media emphasize this is very promising because in the early party Congress, the phrase was that to let market playing a fundamental role in resource allocation. But this time, the new phrase is to allow market to play a decisive role in resource allocation. But however, my interpretation is different because I think I do not see there is a so fundamental difference between to allow market to play a fundamental role and to allow market to play a decisive role. But my emphasis actually is on the so-called overall goal in the beginning of the test, because this is the first time in the old party resolutions in last 2 decades, this overall goal of reform has been explicitly announced. So that's to quote this from the original test. The overall goal of deepening reform is to develop and make it more perfect the system of socialism with Chinese characteristics, and to modernize the system and the capacity of governance of the state. So why I use this highlighted with the red line? Because the first sentence, to develop and make it more perfect the system of socialism with Chinese characteristics, has been in the previous party congresses for the last 2 decades. But what is really new is to modernize system and the capacity of governance of the state. And this is the overall goal, the 总目标, the overall goal. And then my understanding is that because there was some debate among Chinese scholars after this third plenum session, because some people say the system of governance means the rule of law governance, or some other scholar emphasize that rule of law is not enough. We should rule of virtue. We should add rule of virtue plus rule of law. But my interpretation is different from those scholars, because I think if by governance we only mean, like Xi Jinping only mean rule of law or rule of virtue, then there is no point to make a distinction between capacity and the system of the governance. Because if, like, even in the one same state and the one same system of governance, but given time, in different time period, the capacity of governance could be very different, right? If you think about the United States, that during the New Deal period, maybe we can say the capacity of governance increased a lot, but of course, this increase of capacity of government eventually led to the fundamental reformation of the system of governance in the United States after New Deal. So I think what I'm trying to give explanation also, as many years ago I learned from my colleague Charles Sabel on this Mobius trip metaphor. I also draw from Chuck Sabel and Jonathan Zeitlin's work recently on the experimental governance. And I try to argue that actually this Xi Jinping's distinction between system and the capacity of governance can be interpreted as a way to try to introduce experimental governance into China, or to formalize what has been implicit in Chinese practice. So the experimental governance can be understood as an effort to strengthen the system of governance by increasing the capacity of the governance. Okay, so I will quote from Sabel and Zeitlin's article for the Oxford Handbook of Governance, just called Experimental Governance. So it's basically, this experimental governance is, I highlight in the red, is a recursive process of provisional goal setting and revision based on learning from comparison of alternative approaches to advancing them in different contexts. And it consists basically 4 elements. So the first is the broad framework goals and the metrics for gauging their achievement are provisionally established. So emphasize this broad framework goal are provisionally established. And the second, I emphasize in this red line, the local units are given broad discretion to pursue these goals in their own way. And thirdly, as a condition of this autonomy, these units must report regularly on their performance and participate in a peer review in which their results are compared with those of others, employing different means to the same end. And fourth and lastly, the goals, matrix, and the decision-making procedures themselves are periodically revised by a widening circle of actors in response to the problem and the possibilities revealed by the review process, and the cycle repeats. And then Sabel and Zeitlin argue that this experimentalist governance can be viewed in a philosophical sense as an American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey, because they systematically provoke thought about their own assumption and practice, treat all solutions as incomplete, and
corrigible and produce an ongoing reciprocal adjustment of ends and means through comparison of different approach to advancing common general aims. So why I found this framework helpful in illustrate and to interpret this Xi Jinping's grand reform strategy. Because there was a lot of debate in China as well in the West about what is precisely Xi Jinping is up to, and what's the point of these 60 points of reform plans. And so I will argue that overall goal, I just mentioned, 总目标 overall goal is, and then these 60 points, many of the 16 points can be understood as a provisional framework goals in Sabel and Zetlin's sense. And then many localities, different provinces in China are conducting local experiments to follow, to realize those provisionally determined framework goals. And the different localities have different experiments. And ideally, I mean, they should have peer review. And then finally, to have this reciprocal adjustment between end and means and to reevaluate those provisional goals in the first place. And so I will talk about two examples in the point 6 and point 20 in this third plenary session, resolution. And those talk two examples very briefly to realize these two framework goals. So this framework goal in the point 6, that's the original Chinese formulation, but the English translation is roughly as this. This is my roughly my own translation based on some unofficial translation. So this in the point 6 of this third plenary resolution is for the first time they made 3 new formulations. One is actively develop a diversified ownership economy. Diversified ownership 就是混合所有制 integrate the state capital, a collective capital, and the private capital. So mixed enterprise will be allowed to utilize employee stock ownership to form a vested community of capital owners and workers. And then just improve state-owned assets management system and strengthen state asset supervision by focusing on capital management. So this word requires some explanation. By focusing on capital management, what does it mean? Because in the Chinese language, it's called 从以管资本为主. So as distinct from the 管资产, but in English translation, both 资产 and 资本 both translate as capital. So it's not so clear. But what does it mean by capital management? My personal idea is that it's more like portfolio management, but by 管资产 means because basically he means that state capital would be more like Warren Buffett. So Warren Buffett investment company, they invest in many different enterprises. Just the day before yesterday, I read in the news that I mean, maybe for the first time, Buffett made a huge loss in this energy future holding 2 days ago. But anyway, Buffett's point is that he doesn't want to be a controlling shareholder because a controlling shareholder require intervention in macro management. But the portfolio investment is just in some way like a free ride on the creativity of the other entrepreneurships. And so I think this emphasis on the so-called focusing on the capital management is in contrast to very detailed macro management of state-owned enterprises. And so as I said, establish a number of state-owned capital operating companies and back the transformation of qualified state-owned enterprises into state-owned investment companies, transfer some state-owned capital to social security funds, improve state-owned capital operation budget system, and increase the proportion of state capital gain paid in public financing to 30% by 2020, which will be used to ensure and improve people's livelihood. Because this is also for the first time, the party resolution explicitly requires that by 2020, state-owned companies has to deliver up to 30%, deliver 30% of their revenue to the state budget. But so far, they haven't been able to do it. So at most, they, since 2007, 2008, they gave 15%. But this point 6, why I say is in language of experimental governance should be understood as a framework goal, as a provisionally determined and subject to experiment and further revision. But because actually there were a lot of debate among Chinese intellectuals, but also the many practitioners on the meaning of the point 6, because some people, especially more kind of right-wing economists, but if we assume we understand what that means, they emphasize only the term by focusing on capital management, on the portfolio management of state capital, meaning that state will reduce their intervention in the micromanagement. And by this so-called mixed ownership or diversified ownership economy only means the retreat of state capital's controlling share. So they emphasize this point. But other scholars emphasize that we have to understand these 3 points more in a more integrated way. So these 3 points I reiterate is that first, mixed ownership enterprise will be allowed to utilize employee stock ownership to form a vested community of capital owners and workers. So this was the first time in the party resolution, especially mentioned employee stock ownership. Why? Because this I haven't been able to translate into Chinese, but basically in the 2000, in the December of 2000, Chinese Security Exchange Commission has a ruling that for any listed company, they must get rid of employee stock ownership. Because in the reform of state-owned enterprises in the late 80s and 1990s, there were some like trade unions get hold of some of the former state-owned shares. But the regulation of Chinese Security Exchange Company Commission in 2000 is that, so if you want to be a public listed company, you must eliminate employee shareholding plan. So as many of you know, the most famous maybe Chinese internet and electronic equipment company is named Huawei. Actually, it's 98% owned by employees, not only the top management, but really the general employees, 98%. Huawei is already surpassed, like last month, the Ericsson as the #1 world electronic equipment maker. But it is 98% employee owned. So, but this is not, it is not publicly listed. So if Huawei want to be listed as a public company in the Shanghai and the Shenzhen exchange, they must eliminate so their employee ownership plan. However, it seems to me that this third plenary session's resolution requires Chinese Security Exchange Commission to change their regulation in December 2000 which is very much out of date. But so this is another emphasis. For example, myself has been emphasizing this point. But so different, like maybe the neoliberal economists emphasizing state capital will only become portfolio capital, no micromanagement. But people maybe like me emphasize employee stock ownership plan. But other people emphasize other aspects. So there's a lot of debate, but I found, after talking with Chuck Sabel, I realized that actually if we understood this 0.6 as a framework goal, as a provisionally agreed upon by different stakeholders in the Chinese economy and society, and then we see different provinces recently passing different policies, try to implement this mixed ownership or diversified ownership. Then maybe we, if somehow we can also have a peer review to judge the result of this different approach to the same goal of mixed ownership, then that is a more, in a way, it's more interesting interpretation than like a different interpreters emphasizing one point of this the 0.6 on mixed ownership. And so interestingly, 2 months ago, Shanghai has first published their policies regarding Shanghai, the Shanghai locally owned state capital, state assets. And just 2 days ago, the news was that Chongqing, which has been working there to take a leave of absence for 1.5 years, Chongqing 2 days ago has announced that they are going to publicize their decision on Chongqing local government-owned state assets. And the news still hasn't reported the full documents, but in Chongqing's case, the mayor, Huang Qifan, who was the mayor in Bo Xilai's time, but he's still the mayor. And he make an interesting distinction. He thinks the mixed ownership or diversified form of ownership, at least in Chongqing, can take 5 different forms of mixed ownership. So one is what he called Temasek, like this is Singapore state controlling share company. But another is, he exactly mentioned, is a Buffett type of, so Buffett type of mixed ownership means the state capital is more about portfolio management, will not take a controlling share. But in the Temasek, the Singapore type, means the state capital will still have a controlling share. And in Shanghai, like last month, Shanghai published their policy and gave a lot of emphasis on the so-called to list the state-owned company as a whole in the stock market in Shanghai, Shenzhen, or Hong Kong, or the United States. So because before, when a company was listed in stock exchange, usually they inject some capital into this listed company from the parent group. But the Shanghai's idea was to inject almost all good assets into the public listed company. So that this public listed company will become the main, not the parent, unlisted company. So this Shanghai's experiment very much in the Chinese word called 整体上市. So different, we can see the different experiment in different localities, and also the Guangzhou also announced their program. Okay, so now I talk another example of frame goal, which is the point 20 of this 60-point reform program. Oh, by the way, why it is 16 points? There was a joke because Chairman Mao in the early 60s has a 16 points work method with regarding the rural socialist transformation. So some people say Xi Jinping mimic this 60 points, but no matter what, I think it's interesting if we understood these 60 points in terms of a provisional and revisable goals. So this point 20 is about rural-urban integration. So this rough translation. So this put in quite broad and general terms, right? So it says accelerate the building of new forms of agricultural operation system, persist in the basic position of the household operation in agriculture. So it still want to keep the household responsibility system as a basis of rural governance, but move forward with agricultural operation method innovation that jointly develop household operation, collective operations, cooperative operation, and enterprise operation. So what does it mean by cooperative operation and enterprise operation? It could mean the enterprise, maybe the enterprise in the city, which comes to the countryside to operate, become an agro business, together with the rural cooperatives. So this persist in the collective ownership of rural land. So they want to keep the collective ownership of rural land, not to privatize the collective ownership of the rural land. And safeguard the land contracting and operational rights of peasants according to the law, develop and expand the collective economy, stabilize rural land contraction relationship, and maintain their unchanged for a long time. Under the precondition of persisting in and perfecting the strictest arable land protection system, endow peasants with power of possession, use, profit, transmission, mortgage, and guarantee of contracting and operating powers with regard to their contracted land. Peasants are permitted to develop industrialized agricultural operation with the income from contracting operating rights. It is encouraged that contracting and operational rights are transferred to specialized large household farms, peasants' collectives, and agricultural enterprises on the open market, develop operations in many kinds, forms, and scale. So this is very broad and kind of vague, but I think it's perfectly fit this open-ended and provisional framework. So it's basically, he wants to keep collective ownership of land, but also keep each household has a long-term, up to 50 years, the lease right, but also want to encourage cooperation and the economy of scale. So, by allowing different forms of cooperations and urban enterprises to come to the countryside. So this is also subject to the huge debate, and the different people with different ideology and different interests come up with totally different interpretations. And there are many different forms of experimentation in different localities. But for the sake of time, maybe I only mention two of them. One is it actually has been going on for longer time before the 18th Party Congress. It's so-called here I use this so-called shareholding and cooperative system on the basis of land. What does it mean, the shareholding and the cooperative system on the basis of land? So basically, according to the 2007 Chinese new law on property, the lease right of peasants' household, the lease right, is considered a property rights. And so this basically is that the peasants can use their lease right to enter in cooperation with the companies from the urban area, and to use their lease right as a basis for the share of the future revenue of the agro business. So basically, the a company in the urban area can come to the countryside and rebought this sum of the lease for a certain period. But in addition to that, they have some guarantee for the dividend, minimum dividend, and also the more variable dividend for the peasant's household. So this is called shareholding and a cooperative system on the basis of land. This has been going on for longer time before the 18th Party Congress. But there's something new, starting from actually maybe last November and last October, but there were some limited experiment early on also, but so-called land trust. So the trust law is very interesting. If you, some of the legal scholars in this room will remember a famous legal scholar of British legal history, Maitland, has famously argued the most important contribution of Englishmen to the whole world is the trust, because in the civil law countries, like in Germany, France, there was no trust law, because trust law, according to Maitland, way is so interesting because he's divided the traditional unified notion of ownership. Like the trust divided at least the ownership right into 3 separate independent powers, like a right to, like the right, like the principal and the trustee and the beneficiary. And it's very difficult to pin down in the civil law language, like who is the final owner. There are a lot of debate about trust and what is the dead hand, so-called dead hand principle of trust. But this very interesting thing is, like according to Maitland, the trust is the most flexible and important innovation in the British legal history. And as you know, that China, since the late Qing dynasty in the beginning of 20th century, borrowed the civil law system from Germany. And, but China also introduced a trust law in the 1980s. And, but interesting, since last November, a large-scale experiment in several localities based on the trust law has been going on. So basically, it's indifferent from the shareholding and the cooperative system on the basis of land I mentioned earlier. This land trust is basically like a trust company will come. They made the like rural collective, like the whole collective, the village, like a principal to, and this trust company become a trustee, but for the benefit of each and every member of this village. And but what's different from the shareholding and cooperative system? I think depends on there are many concrete contract, but most basically is that this agro business, like a enterprise from the city, in the land trust system, only become a service provider. And so before, maybe this agro business company in the city come to sign a contract directly with the village. But in the land trust system, this rural agro business, this urban agro business company will sign a service contract with the trust company. And depend on some design of the concrete design contract. So in one experiment in Anhui province, they gave 70% of the increase of the basic rents to the beneficiary, namely each and every member of the village committee. And also, this mobilizes more financial resources because this trust company has more revenue, more channels for mobilizing necessary finance than just a simple urban agribusiness. But my point here is not to evaluate concretely the success and the failure of each of those local experimental approaches, both in terms of state-owned enterprises and in terms of land system reform, in the rural land system, the land trust or shareholding and the cooperative system on the basis of land. But my point is simply to illustrate that if we, through this experimental governance perspective, we may gain some new insights on what's Xi Jinping's grand reform design is up to. But of course, maybe this is my idiosyncratic interpretation. It is my, but if you read Umberto Eco's, this Italian thinker and novelist, he has a book called Interpretation and Overinterpretation. But maybe this is my overinterpretation, but I think it's not completely off the mark, because because otherwise it's very difficult to make sense of these very, very long documents, right? So I will conclude. So basically, my interpretation is that first is the overall goal. Then there was basically 60 points framework goal, provisional design, and then to allow local experiments. And then, hopefully, they will be able to compare those local experiments and revise those framework goals. But however, I will conclude by, so this is the, I think there are still some weakness in, because this, I start by citing Chuck Sabel's and Jonathan Zeitlin's article for the Oxford Handbook of Governance. So these 4 points of 4 elements of experimental governance. So I think the first 2 totally apply perfectly in Chinese case. But in the second and the fourth, especially the second, I think the Chinese practice already have implicit this peer review and comparison of approach to different approaches to the same provisional determined goals. However, I think this process in China is less institutionalized. So there are less open debate on the different approaches to the same provisional determined goal. So there are some, for example, I mentioned this Chongqing experiment starting from 2007 in my another talk earlier in New School. I think there were many interesting points in the Chongqing experiment. However, it got lost because for this political scandal, but also for the lack of fully open discussion and the debate. And so the third element of experimental governance, namely through open discussion and the peer review to compare different approach to the same provisional determined goal, is not fully and not well developed in China so far. So it certainly is my hope that it will be developed further. So that leads to the end of my talk, because that's the implication for political reform. And this, one of the interesting things about experimental governance is that, so maybe I simply put, so the end of this quotation from Chuck is that the assumption, in other words, is that structural impediments can best and perhaps only be identified and surmounted in the course of a reform process that generate concrete solutions, not in anticipation of it. Because a lot of criticism about the Chinese political system implies that we best approach is to confront the top immediately. And but it's interesting. It's an interesting implication that this experimental governance argues that actually we don't have to confront, or even the best, or even the only way is to identify and surmount it in the course of a reform process that generate a concrete solution, not in anticipation of it. But of course, maybe this is too optimistic a view of the world, but I think it's not it's not without reason, because Okay, so I guess maybe it's best for me to stop and have your criticism, comments, and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think all of you can see why Professor Cui has been dubbed one of the leading figures of the Chinese New Left. I'm sure there'll be a lot to debate, including the practical aspects of the future program of which he sees the seeds here. And as he mentioned, and I didn't mention in my introduction, among other things, he did work as the Assistant Director of the State Asset Management Committee of Chongqing government, as many of you already know, who were here at his earlier talk. And so there is a practical experience which is very much in the background when he speaks at even at a rather abstract level, as he seemed to in his remarks today. So we have three discussants who are very eminent ones. First of all, we have Mark Frazier, my colleague and co-academic director of the India-China Institute, who is a distinguished writer on the political economy of China with a focus on labor movements and social policy. Many of you know him and his work, so I don't have to go on at greater length about him, but he is a very apt discussant on these topics. Second, we have Chuck Sabel, whose work has already been extensively referred to today. And let me apologize, Chuck, for not knowing that, in fact, Mobius strip ownership is attributable to you. But I'm not entirely surprised because of the intimate relation between the different ideas that have been discussed over the years by Professor Cui and Roberto Unger and others under the broad heading of democratic experimentalism, which you have yourself, of course, extensively authored and been the architect of. Well, there's much to say about Professor Sabel, but I won't say all of it, except to say that he is currently Professor of Law and Social Science at Columbia Law School, which doesn't, of course, do justice to the breadth of his discipline-spanning interests and his very deep, even profound innovations in the field of, well, maybe I could just as well as anything call it Work in Politics, which was the title of his first book, which I recommend to all of you. And then finally, we have Vakulabharanam, who we're very lucky to have here. This is, in fact, his last day here after a number of weeks in New York with us at the India-China Institute, who is a professor of economics at the University of Hyderabad and a longtime friend of the India-China Institute, and somebody who's tried very hard to do comparative work on India and China and integrate them both, and indeed other Asian countries, into a comparative political economic analysis of what is happening under contemporary globalization. Each of the speakers will have 5 to 7 minutes, as I mentioned, and we have a timekeeper on the right who will signal to you. So please, Mark, to start.
Thank you. Shall we speak from here, or maybe put the video to come up here? Well, it's just a great honor to be asked to comment and to be asked to comment first on such a very rich and detailed exegesis of part of, I think we had 2 of the 60 points, 2 of the most important of the 60 points, and it's not my intention to go into the other 58. There is an English translation that Professor Cui provided to me and others this afternoon. Of course, it's been around since November when the party's Central Committee issued the document in Chinese, and then for the English-speaking and English-reading audience, who was, as he said, very eager to try to interpret this. And I remember very well this initial reading of the joint communique, and very disappointing. Not enough of the word SOE reform and liberalization certainly in there. And then this satisfactory feeling that, now that once the full text, the decision comes out, there's this sense of, he is going to deepen liberalization processes in the SOE sector, which, as he said, like with any important document, the people who read it bring their own interpretations, their own ideological positions into the reading and interpretation of that document. But what I wanted to do in the brief time I have is to cover, and just in response to hearing the talk, provide some context on the Chinese context, or the historical context of the Chinese Communist Party on the practice of experimental governance, because I think it's a very important tradition that needs to be understood in this document. And then talking secondly about relations between the state agencies in particular, and state-owned enterprises, and you know, they're both the state, but I think there are major tensions between the two sides of that regulator and regulated divide. And then third, to talk about something else that was in the, you know, I guess one or maybe two of the points that were in the 60 points was corruption and anti-corruption, which is certainly one of the ways that I think Xi Jinping and his administration is trying to make a stamp on governance, and the relationship possibly between the anti-corruption campaign that we're all hearing about and the pursuit of some of these specific goals. So with the experimental governance, there is a book that many people are citing these days entitled Mao's Invisible Hand. Invoking Adam Smith with Mao. It's a book, it's an edited volume, and it contains many different chapters on both historical and contemporary political economy of China, but particularly governance issues. And the main takeaway point that the editors and the chapter authors make is that in the Chinese Communist governance tradition, there's a very rich history of not being wedded to rigid, bureaucratic, regulatory governance structures. We all, most of us in this room anyway, if you haven't read anything of the selected works of Mao anytime recently or ever, you probably know that he was a big enemy of bureaucracy, and the party has this long-standing, almost dialectical relationship between effective governance, mobilization, campaigns, getting things done, and then the fear often, as Mao and his successors have always worried about, of how bureaucracy can seep in, bureaucratic practices and rigidities can seep in, and what that does to governance. So the party has this, going back to the base area days in the 1930s and 40s, when under combat, this notion of giving local officials who are out there by themselves in base areas and related areas in which the CCP had to figure out relationships with rural producers, what forms of ownership, what forms of taxation, what forms of public service, of goods provision would be enacted. And I think that governance capacity and a dedication to experimentalism really emerged from this. There's an expression that would be translated into English as something like "from point to surface," so that you take the most successful experiments and then you try to move them across the surface of the territory, move them across the national map, move them across maybe the provincial map. So we see this, you could take this to special economic zones in the early reform era as another example of an experiment, looking at its lessons and then trying to, I'm not saying that it's automatic that the best lessons are taken and the best practices are diffused and everybody's happy, but it is certainly a different approach to governance and regulation than we would think of if we try to think in relatively narrow categories of coordinated market economies, let's say, and liberal market economies, or the categories that we're often used to seeing in studies of Western political economies. Second point related to state agency versus state-owned enterprise relations. I have a particular question for Professor Sui, and that is, should we think of these state-owned enterprises, 100 only some odd enterprises these days, but with many, many, branches and plants and factories and so forth and mines all over the world? Should we think of them as powerful corporate interests that we would see in a Western or any other capitalist economy that is resistant to attempts at regulation that are effective and becoming more effective at lobbying, and will, at the end of the day, if China is a capitalist economy, I'm not saying that it is, but capitalism, if we understand capitalism, we think that the conclusion is that the business interests, the controllers of the owners of the means of production, are the powerful ones, and the regulators, the state, are the ones who are doing the bidding of the powerful. So, is there going to be, and certainly there already is, a tension between documents like this and efforts like this to regulate and to say to them 30% of your revenues or maybe 30% of your profits have to be turned over in the form of essentially taxes to provide for social welfare? It seems to me that the prospects of resistance are very, very high. And I think this is not a new pattern, but it's something that, as this effort is ramped up, I think the pushback could be quite strong. The other related question is, does the document, as some people interpreting it have said, does the document contain a greater push for state-owned enterprises to have to face competition? That is, that it's one thing to have the mixed ownership pattern, but then to say that we're going to remove some of the structural barriers and other kinds of barriers that have prevented you from facing more direct forms of competition. That was just one of the things that I heard out of the, more, liberal political economy approaches to the reading of this document, was that, state-owned enterprises will have to face competition now. And so doesn't it, do you see competition being endorsed in this and related to the, as going back to my prior question, won't there be pushback and resistance against such anti-competitive, or I guess pro-competitive kinds of policies? The other thing that's very interesting, as I heard you're talking about these companies being listed on various exchanges, of course, is that the securities regulators in China have said that you must list your major shareholders. And what this has led to, very interestingly, I think, is the New York Times and Bloomberg and other heavily resourced Western media outlets going through every single corporate annual report of these places and figuring out who the major shareholders are. They're companies, they're not named individuals, figuring out that that's the nephew of Zhou Yongkang or Xi Jinping. This was in 2012, Xi Jinping's family came under heavy fire for making billions in the initial public offerings of many of these companies. Wan Jiabao's family, modest Uncle Wan, his relatives were deemed to be super billionaires if you calculated based on the kinds of companies. And then just last week, Zhou Yongkang, the former Politburo Standing Committee member, former as in stepped down in fall of 2012, is now under major investigation. No one's seen him. No one has seen his relatives. So the Times is reporting on something we knew, which is that many people in his family, including him, have disappeared, but that they were also making billions on this. So I guess a question that emerges from this is, and it takes me into my final point, which is the anti-corruption campaign. So do you see, or should we see this document and the specific texts that it has in it about corruption, saying things that Xi Jinping has said way before he became party secretary, that our governing capacity as a party, our governance ability is directly weakened by corruption. He told officials in a province he was the party secretary of 10 years ago or so, rein in your family, rein in your friends, rein in your colleagues, rein in your personal staff, because if you don't, then we'll all collapse. So, it's a question, but I think it's also a point I'd like to throw out to everyone, which is that I see the anti-corruption effort as a direct part of this effort to engage in structural reforms of ownership and various forms of governance and regulation of the state-owned enterprises. Final point is, and question, given the complexities of the things you described, such as the land trusts, how it seems to me a recipe for all sorts of corruption by local officials to manipulate the market, to manipulate the asymmetries in information that a farming family might have as they're engaging in a contract with a land trust. And the problem, is it not, that in this document there's nothing about anti-corruption being led by legal means or media or NGOs. It's all the party will reform its anti-corruption efforts, and we will achieve our goals by basically cleaning ourselves up, but still being unmonitored by any other outside organization. Okay, thank you very much.
So it's a wonderful, wonderful pleasure to be here and to comment on the extremely thoughtful views of my old friend and fellow traveler, I guess is the appropriate word, Julian, and to see Sanjay again after some years. I want to address my remarks to the utility of this interpretation. That's self-interested. I want it, but I also want to say that one of the things that's useful about it is that it suggests some very testable propositions, and Jiwan mentioned some of them towards the end. But against the backdrop that Mark filled in for us, that there is culturally, for want of a better word, there's some fit between the Chinese sense of working things through and going from general ideas to practice and back and forth. There's no reason not to call that dialectic in some deep way. And this more formalized idea of experimentalism. Let's just assume that if you read the work of Sebastian Heilmann or all the Dewey or the accounts of Dewey's reception in China, there's enough there for academic purposes. Now the question is there something there that's actually worth something beyond that? So let me suggest that Jiwan just showed us, at least, that there is likely and in what that would consist. And one way to do that is to ask, I'm unencumbered by any particular knowledge of China, so it's easy for me to adopt the posture that I'm now going to suggest is of heuristic value. Let's ask how someone would interpret this from the standpoint of either a Western analysis of such a document, a legislative program, a government program, or from the point of view of somebody who is involved in let's call them sinological, the traditional fights within communist parties, as those are interpreted either by Westerners who study such things or people who are in the midst of them themselves. So from the familiar West, the political science point of view, there's a completely obvious explanation which renders this completely uninformative and, in fact, useless as a point of orientation. And it's just that there are lots of groups in China and they're fighting with each other, and they needed to put forth a document that would be acceptable to all, at least to the point of view in the minimal sense of allowing some consensus declaration that would gesture at this muddle as a program worthy of accord. So one view is there is no meaning to be sought, and it was a good thing there was a precedent for stopping at 60 points, because otherwise there would have been 600. And so that's the first view. And the second view is that's wrong. There's a secret code with which to read these things, and some words mean more or other than what they say, and the difference between fundamental and decisive is decisive or fundamental, depending on which code you have, and then you can argue about the codes. And from that point of view, too, the actual substance is irrelevant, because you're looking for the master word or phrase or the hierarchy of assertions that reveals to you what's the actual dominant, the predominant line, the thrust, the axis of action. So, Juan proposes another alternative, and the alternative is that people actually mean something, not something completely precise, but something recognizable, actionable, and something which they can agree is worthy of practical investigation. And he gave us two quite amazing examples, point 6 and point 20. And why do I say they're amazing? Because you could just say, well, that's not a very hard test. Not a very hard test. Something that's less than hopelessly general, but not obviously implementable in its current degree of precision. How hard is it to think of words that fit that criteria, those criteria? Not so hard. Not so hard. But that isn't actually what I heard. And it was only upon hearing this that I actually, you could begin to see the full force of the interpretation. Because what I heard was a description of institutions that I never heard of before. Lots of them. Not just one or two, but a cascade of institutional forms that, yes, Mark, you're right, they may contain, they're not simple, but the question is not whether they're not simple in the sense that they're baroque, susceptible of obfuscation, easily manipulated, or they're not simple in the sense that they don't simply fit our existing categories. And I think they may be the first, but they're absolutely certainly the second, as illustrated by this idea of trust. I won't repeat the various forms, but they're intriguing. They're intriguing. Sometimes they're distinctive in themselves, and sometimes they link familiar organizations in a way that your experience is broader than mine. But I'm a connoisseur of bizarre possibilities, and it's like coming across some zone of life where none of the creatures are cognizable. You recognize their evolutionary affinities, but you, even without being able to assign them a taxon, you know there's something different. And there were a lot. There were a lot. And they seem purposeful. They seem purposeful. This notion of trust, for example, but the point is not to get to the bottom of them, because they don't have a bottom, because they don't have a top. But they do mark the way forward. So the first thing is that by taking seriously the possibility that there might be something to take seriously, you bring to light a whole series of propositions that are simply discarded in the familiar interpretations, just not there. And not only are they not, they're not mappable onto the familiar interpretations. And they suggest not just the possibility that the Chinese might be doing something experimental, but that they might actually be, in fact, they must obviously be doing something deeply novel. Not experimenting to find new ways to familiar things, but finding new things. let me come, because time is short, let me come to the empirical parts and the challenge. So, Yuan said quite correctly, at least I think, that this simple four-part schematic, the third and the fourth parts are much harder to demonstrate. The third part, the peer review, if you read this Heilman and these others, and the literature about how the cadre system works, there is some informal system, the party schools, many different things, quite complex. Not easy to know how generation after generation, when there are more failures than successes, the failures get picked for propagation. That's not a trivial problem to solve, and yet the Communist Party has solved it over in an iterated way without formalizing. So there's a question, is this a step in the direction of formalizing it? And then there's a further question about, is this a step towards formalization, which also opens to broader discussion, democracy, all the words that are at the side. The last point. I concur completely that this idea that I suppose in the thing you cited, the notion is there are no abstract answers to the deepest structural problems. So, for example, Marx said we should be very cautious because the party asserts the exclusive right to prosecute, root out corruption. That seems impossible, that the agent of corruption would be the agent of anti-corruption. That doesn't. And the obvious response then would be, so we need an anti-corruption agency. And the obvious response to that is, that obviously won't work. We know that won't work. And so at one level, the claim is banal. We can't just proclaim these things. But the question is, and it's an empirical question, we should be able to go to different places and see these experiments in progress. We should be able to go to different places and see whether there's a profusion of new mechanisms for pooling information, and we should be able to go and see whether that spills over, to use a very old-fashioned kind of word, but reverberates into a deeper kind of change that addresses these structural limits. Wonderful.
Thank you, Cui, for a very fascinating presentation. It's really hard for me to discuss this presentation because I just heard it, and I can't read Chinese, so I haven't read the 60 points of the third plenum. But let me comment on the economic aspects. Let me just throw out 3-4 comments. I think the fundamental value of your presentation is that you provide a certain interpretation which makes it clear that the 60 points can be interpreted in multiple ways, right? So the value of that for me, when I think about the Chinese context, is that what will actually happen in the next decade or so will be determined not by the text of or the 60 points, but actually what real struggles are going to take place around these multiple interpretations, and which direction is China going to be pushed, I think. And I think it's therefore important that these multiple interpretations are made, and people start fighting around or organizing their struggles around that. I think that's the value of the presentation as I see it. But one thing struck me, especially after the global crisis of 2008, and the fact that now everybody knows that China has a very high level of inequality, and this has to be addressed. Why is the entire focus on this old and worn-out debate about market versus the state? That's the axis around which seemingly this entire document seems to be positioned. And that was a little, I was struck by the strangeness of this, Why is there no direct emphasis on something like inequality? Why are they not talking directly about, creating, more domestic demand, for instance? Why can't the 60 points be focused around that question, especially when it's clear that, Chinese economy has slowed down considerably relative to its own growth rates earlier. And there's some kind of a sense of a crisis, economic crisis, right? So that's the first point. The second point is, while your interpretation is valuable, I do have some skepticism about, your interpretation, especially when you started, you said, one thing I've read, when the document actually came out is, the basic, market used to play a basic role, right, in the earlier documents. You said fundamental, and, they changed it to the word decisive. And, the Chinese policymakers are never innocent, right? That word actually means something. It's not mere semantics. So they do want to, do something with this new formulation. But your interpretation seems to suggest that, that is not necessarily the case. So there I'm a little skeptical, Clearly there is something that, the policymakers mean to do, right? And point 6, could be interpreted. And I'm asking the question, why are you disregarding that interpretation? Point 6 could be interpreted as public sector divestment, disinvestment from the public sector, which has been, a huge demand in the Chinese context for a long time. So why is that? You didn't provide enough argument to actually, question that interpretation, right? Or if you come to point 20, there are lots of struggles in rural areas around land, right? Lots of protests and so forth. So why is this not a clever way of rendering land as a commodity? These are questions that, that immediately come up in the context of, reformulating market in a more decisive role, right? So is it a process of commodification, right? So that's the second point. And from your presentation, I got the sense that, somehow in an oblique way, in a non-transparent way, this will address inequality. I'm also colored by your Friday presentation on Chongqing. So, somewhere you feel that, in an indirect way, this will address questions of inequality. But I don't see, apart from your interpretation about land trust, which could potentially address the rural-urban divide. Although I'm still not clear how it will do exactly. How is the interregional inequality going to be addressed? How is the, the intra-urban inequality, especially the class inequality that has really, become very significant? How is that going to be addressed, through any of these points? And that's I think, that has to be carefully understood, even if you are willing to give it a different interpretation. So, to, combined with other things like, when I read the other interpretations, people talk about, capital account liberalization, for instance, which is part of the 60 points, right? Complete liberalization of the capital account. But right. So some people have interpreted it as, the document suggesting, complete capital account liberalization. And, it's clearly stated, I think, in the document that resource allocations will not be mediated by the state any longer. Market will take over, soon. So let me leave you with a large question. Going back to David Harvey, is this an attempt to sort of complete the project of, creating a neoliberal China, or, having neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics, as opposed to socialism with Chinese characteristics? Thank you.
Thank you. We have very little time, and I'm sure there are other questions, a number of distinguished faculty who are present here, and others. So, excuse me. If I may ask our senior leader, Ashok Gurung, if we may go 5 minutes beyond 8, and if there's no the general uprising against that. That will give us a few minutes to first to collect some questions, and then we can go back to Professor Sui for his reaction. So let me ask if any of you have questions to please raise your hands. I see a number of them. So I'll start on the right side and come to this side. Professor Lily Ling, first of all. Thank you. Yes, please, if you wouldn't mind, because this is being live webcast, it would be helpful if you spoke into a microphone.
Okay.
Thank you.
I've now had the pleasure of hearing Professor Cui speak on 3 occasions, and so now I think I have a better understanding of your intellectual project, and so my comment is really on your intellectual project, which is a very different perspective from those of economists who tend to focus on outcomes and empirics. Previously, you talked about the liberalism in Chinese socialism. You referred to James Meade and other characters like that. And I was a little bit puzzled why you were doing that. Today, what I heard was the socialism in Chinese liberalism. And this tended to balance the intellectual project more, in that you were recognizing the liberalism in socialism as well as the socialism in liberalism. And this intellectual project is highly evocative of traditional Chinese thought, particularly dialectical thought. And given this, then, the response to Chuck Sabel's question about these novel ideas, particularly in conceiving of the central government and local governance loosening a little bit to allow for experimentation, it evokes actually ancient Chinese experimentation before the Communist Revolution. And in particular, I'm thinking of the Huainanzi. The Huainanzi was a classical Taoist document of governance according to Taoist dialectical principles. And it focused in particular on the relationship between a central ruling force and localities. And it conceived of this relationship in a lively, experimental, and flexible way. So it suggests to me that your intellectual project would benefit from identifying Chinese sources of this kind of thinking, so that it does not seem to the uninitiated that these are novel ideas, but rather have deep roots, deep organic roots, and that this answers some of the empirical questions about, experimentation and outcomes and things like that, to place it within a larger historical, cultural, and intellectual context. And given that you are working towards identifying a Chinese understanding of the relationship not only between center and periphery, but socialism and liberalism, I think that this will contribute tremendously to current discourses, so that we are not seeing neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics, not at all, but rather we are seeing something, maybe an updated Huainanzi. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have very little time, so if I could ask the remaining questioners to please be brief, I'd appreciate it. We would appreciate it very much, because otherwise there'll be no chance to hear response at all. So I think there was one. Was there any other hand on this side? I'm going to take both of you, Professor Riskin at the end. Please, if you don't mind, just because it's being videotaped and live webcast, a live webcast is taking place. Yeah, please.
So my name is Alasia Lefebvre, Columbia University, and I've had the pleasure to work at Tsinghua many years ago with Zhu Yuan. The question, very brief. So you seem to suggest that this experimental governance, Xi Jinping one, is different from the previous one because of this formalization, and even though you point out the lack of debate, sufficient debate for the moment, I would like to ask you if you can reflect on your own experience as an intellectual and a scholar in the administration, in the local government. It's not something that only you did. It's something that it's more and more common among your colleagues, especially in School of Public Affairs, Public Administration. Is this practice going to influence, according to you, this Xi Jinping style experimental governance? What is the role of intellectuals in China today when they go to local government? How this accelerates or not the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have well, there are two questions. Goodness, suddenly there's been a propagation. I see now 4 hands, and we really don't have time unless you literally take 30 seconds each. Raise your hands if you can take 30 seconds each. Okay, so we have 4. Please, gentlemen at the back.
Davide Guarezzi, University of Padua, Italy.
Would you mind speaking in from the front, if you don't mind? Yeah. And please, our timekeeper, could you please keep time and raise your hands, because we now have very little time left. Thank you.
Davide Guarezzi, University of Padua, Italy. Very simple, 2 questions. Can we summarize in extreme simplistic terms that what you're saying is that within same ownership relationship, the reform implies further private capital penetration, and that we are interpreting in that sense the difference between fundamental and decisive role of the market in resources allocation? Second question, I didn't understand fully the role of the state in these mixed enterprises, especially the first model. I understood 2 things. One, you want to get rid of employees' participation in order to be listed in the Shanghai Stock Exchange. Then you have to, and then now, and the second question is that I don't understand. Is state
in 1 sentence, please?
Is the state going to retain that macroeconomic governance that you said is not to be allowed to the private investors?
Thank you so much. Thank you. Please. I'm sorry. First, the lady. Yes, Professor Chin. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Qin Gao. I'm a professor at Fordham University, currently also a visiting scholar at the India-China Institute. My question is, most of the 60 points, as you talked about, are purposefully left very vague and ambiguous. However, there's one point which you mentioned, is that the government requires those enterprises to contribute 30% of their public, capital gains to people's livelihood, which is very ambitious and very definite. So people could hold the government accountable. And and some other people's estimates currently say the government only spends up to 10%, or even at a low level of 5% on public finance, people's livelihood. How could they jump to 30% by 2020? Thank you.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions. First, yes, and then Carl Riskin. Thank you, to end.
Okay, Martin Rivlin, Columbia and CUNY. What Charles Sabel said is very interesting, but the question, of course, will be implementation, as you and I both know. All right, very quickly, because of time, what do you see, is there a systemic implication, or is it just another of an example in this corruption charge against Zhou Yonggang? And finally, which you don't have to answer, do you expect any reevaluation in June 4th?
Okay, finally, Carl Riskin. And then after that, Professor Cui has 3 minutes to respond. Maybe 5 if you're all generous to him.
I'm going to stand up to show how quick I'm going to be. As of something like 2007, there were about 66 million peasants who had already lost their land to land grabs. Zhou Qiren came to Columbia recently and to speak about land grabs and the struggle for land, but he talked about these land trusts. I listened very carefully, but I didn't understand how that was going to solve the problem. Perhaps, Julian, you can explain that? Thank you.
Julian, please. I'm going to take the liberty of saying you can have 5, all right? And then we'll end promptly. Please.
So thank you all for those very challenging questions. I wish I could answer. I could answer all of them, but I really do not have a ready answer to many of them. And about Mark's point about corruption, I agree with you. It's a very serious problem. And as a matter of fact, actually, one of the 60 points explicitly address that the party want to bring in more new
stakeholders in the anti-corruption campaign. For example, the media has been playing more important role. Just like last week, there was important state-owned enterprises, Huarun, yeah, this very, there was a reporter kept writing letters, right? Just 2 weeks ago, this CEO of Huarun, the big state-owned company, has been, whose name is Song Lin, has been dismissed. And so the documents, there's one point explicitly ask more social participation, bring in no new actors in the process, and also they simplify the registration for the NGOs. So this also different localities like Guangzhou, for Guangdong, maybe has gone further in the simplification for the registration of NGOs. Yeah, about Zhu Yongkang, and several of you mentioned the Zhu Yongkang case. I do not know the detail, of course, but I think, yeah, there are some still, people can think of a degree of difference. Like, for example, if your son or the wife were corrupted, and there's some degree of difference between, like, for example, your sister maybe had some, became rich. And then I think people still can make some, but I think somehow I got lost track of about land trust and Carl's point. Yeah, but first I don't think the 66 million peasants lost their land. I think that's the figure must be too high. It's not. I mean, it's not possible, and it's a basic. Fundamental regime in the rural land ownership is still has still been kept, and we I think we should give more space and for those local experiments. But I also have some worry because as I relate to the third point in comparison to the experimental governance, because relative lack of transparency and open debate. So the comparison of different approaches may not have been fully developed. I think that's the weak point of Chinese version of experimental governance, and we should strengthen it by all means. And so I think that's related to the point about the role of scholars. I think I personally learned a lot by working in 1.5 years in the local government. And yeah, because I learned a lot, because I think the scholars tend to, including myself, I mean, to think in a very abstract way and try to find ready answers in advance. But this working experience in local governments, I think I'm becoming more and more interested in pragmatism as a way of thinking. But I'm glad Professor Lin mentioned this has a deep Chinese cultural roots in Huainanzi. So I want to learn more from you. And I think my classical Chinese education is too limited, but I should definitely learn more. And I must have missed some important questions. But maybe I should end here. So thank you again for your wonderful questions.